The moment she was shoved back into the aisle, her backpack scraping against the polished floor. 12-year-old Talia Greene felt the weight of every eye in the cabin on her. She wasn't supposed to be here, or at least that's what the flight attendant seemed to think. "This isn't your section." The woman snapped her voice, carrying across the quiet hum of the first-class cabin. Talia's chest tightened as the bright overhead lights reflected off the rows of leather seats, sparkling cutlery, and the cold indifference in the passengers' faces. She held up her boarding pass, fingers trembling, but the grip of authority had already been claimed. The cabin fell silent, except for the soft hiss of the air conditioning, each breath heavy with tension. Talia's hoodie was plain grey, her sneakers scuffed backpack stuffed with notebooks, and a laptop she had been coding on all night. She was exhausted, her body sore from hours of running between airports, conference rooms, and hotel lobbies. Her asthma inhaler was in her pocket, a lifeline she might soon need. But she kept it hidden, aware of how every move she made was being judged. The flight attendant stepped closer, tilting her head, scrutinizing the girl as though she were a problem to be solved. "Step aside, young lady. First class is for paying passengers." "Not?" She cut herself off, her eyes narrowing. In row 1, a businessman in his 60s shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping a leather briefcase. His grey hair glinted in the cabin light as he watched the confrontation unfold. He murmured something to his neighbor, a retired teacher with pearl earrings and a quilted handbag, but neither spoke too loudly. They had seen situations like this before: children, teenagers, or young adults being judged for appearances. But something in Talia's posture made them pause. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't panicked. She was focused, calculating, waiting. The flight attendant grabbed the boarding pass again, inspecting it under the harsh LED glow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This must be fake," she muttered, then raised her voice to the cabin. "This passenger is refusing to leave her assigned seat. Security will be notified." The words landed like a gavel striking stone. The passengers shifted in their seats, the subtle click of a phone camera registering the tension. Talia's eyes scanned the faces around her, measuring reactions, cataloguing every movement, every breath. Minutes stretched. A steward, younger, barely 28, approached cautiously. "Ma'am, please step back." "Let me check this for you," he said, trying to soften the aggression, his hands trembling slightly. He knew the authority of the first attendant. He also recognized that something about this girl was different. Talia extended her wrist to show the code on her watch, a subtle signal she wasn't hiding anything illicit. The steward hesitated, caught between protocol and intuition as the air in the cabin thickened with the scent of tension and high-end perfume. Suddenly, the main cabin door slid open with a muted clunk. A tall, broad man in his early 50s appeared, his grey suit, immaculate shoes, polished to a mirror shine. His presence alone shifted the energy in the room. He moved with deliberate calm, each step echoing softly against the cabin floor, and his eyes were fixed on Talia. He didn't glance at the attendant, didn't pause to greet the passengers. He knelt beside his daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, with a gentleness that belied his immense authority. "Dad." Talia's voice was barely audible, a whisper caught between fear and relief. Her eyes were wide, chest rising shallowly as the first flush of oxygen returned after the tight grip on her wrists had begun to ease. The flight attendant froze, hands mid-air. the grip of authority slipping for the first time. She had no idea who she was facing. David Greene, CEO of a global technology conglomerate, had arrived not just as a protective parent, but as a man whose decisions could ground this airline for days. His daughter's safety, her dignity, and her voice had all been undermined by a blind assumption, and he would not allow that mistake to go unanswered. Passengers leaned forward instinctively, cameras lifting, the murmur of disapproval rising. Even the elderly businessman in the first row straightened, as though suddenly aware of the gravity beyond the shiny cabin and silver trays. The steward nearby stepped back, uncertain eyes darting between father and daughter. David's gaze hardened, steady as steel, but his voice was calm. "Step away from her," he said, precise, controlled. The steward flinched. The flight attendant's lips parted, but no sound came out. Authority had shifted, and the shift was unmistakable. Talia, still seated, felt the adrenaline ebb slowly. She had been judged restrained and nearly broken, but she had survived the first wave. She watched her father now not as a man of power, but as a protector, a shield, a reckoning waiting to unfold. The cabin air seemed heavier, almost taut, as though the walls themselves were bracing for the confrontation to come. The steward cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "So protocol." David's voice cut through like a blade, calm, undeniable. "I am aware of protocol. Right now, the protocol is to ensure my daughter's safety. Everyone else, including crew, will follow my instructions." The cabin was silent. The murmur of phones recording live streaming, capturing every second of this moment, had turned into a collective breath held. Maya's chest heaved slowly. The zip ties had left marks, her wrists red and tender, but she no longer felt powerless. Every glance around the cabin told her that the perception of weakness had been shattered. Authority had been tested, assumptions challenged, and a new hierarchy had been silently established. The attendant's jaw tightened. Her hands twitched, caught between protocol and fear, as David stood, his presence towering, yet measured. "You will release her," he said. Each word deliberate, slicing through the tension, "and you will review your procedures before treating a minor like a threat again." Passengers exhaled in unison, some whispering, others clicking their phones to ensure every detail was documented. Talia's eyes met her father's. No words passed between them, but the understanding was complete. She had been underestimated, misjudged, and restrained. He had arrived. And now the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. Outside, through the cabin windows, the tarmac shimmered under the fading sunlight. The engines thrummed softly, oblivious to the storm that had just unfolded within. Talia sat upright, hands still tingling, inhaler untouched now. The flight attendant backed away, a blush creeping across her face, realizing that everything she had assumed had been spectacularly wrong. David Greene straightened, surveying the cabin. Each passenger, every recorded moment, every lingering whisper would carry the story beyond this plane. But his eyes remained on his daughter, steady, vigilant. This was far from over. The fight for justice, for dignity, had only just begun, and the first chapter of reckoning had been written in the quiet fury of a father's resolve and a daughter's endurance. The plane hummed, engines warming, and Talia's eyes closed for a moment, drawing a deep, steadying breath. For the first time since boarding, She felt the air in the cabin, as it should be calm, controlled hers. The story was far from over, but the first battle had been won. The moment the cabin doors slid closed behind the last boarding passenger, the tension inside the first-class section didn't dissipate. Talia Greene sat stiffly, hands still trembling slightly from the zip tie's memory, while her father David Greene leaned over, whispering instructions. "Breathe slowly. Keep your eyes on me. Everything is under control." His voice was calm, but his eyes scanned the cabin, assessing every threat, every potential escalation. Brenda Miller, the lead flight attendant, stood frozen near the galley. Her fingers pressed to her lips, blinking rapidly. The entire aisle felt smaller, compressed by the weight of judgment, the silent authority David carried into the room. The passengers closest to the incident shifted in their seats, some leaning forward to see others craning their necks to capture angles on their phones. The murmur of whispered speculation bounced off the polished panels and brass accents of the cabin. David straightened and addressed Brenda directly, his tone firm but measured. "You will unlock her immediately and step aside. No further interference. Do you understand?" Brenda's mouth opened closed, and she nodded reluctantly. Her eyes were wide, her composure cracking as the magnitude of the situation settled on her shoulders. A young flight attendant, barely 26, approached cautiously. "Sir, can I assist?" He glanced at David, then at Talia, uncertainty flickering across his features. David's gaze softened slightly toward him. "Yes. Help her adjust her seatbelt. Ensure she has access to her inhaler. Observe, don't intervene unless necessary." The young man swallowed hard and nodded immediately, moving to help Talia as she exhaled through pursed lips, trying to steady her racing heart. The air marshal, Jim Miller, hovered near the forward cabin, still tense from the earlier confrontation. His posture was rigid, arms folded, lips pressed in a thin line. He hadn't expected to be rendered powerless by a teenage girl, and her father, a man whose calm authority rivaled the drill of any federal protocol he had trained for over 20 years. David's presence rendered the marshal's previous dominance null. Outside the cabin, the captain's voice came over the intercom, precise and clipped. "Flight crew, prepare for departure. Ensure all passengers are seated and secured. Please report to the cockpit in 5 minutes for a final check." The tone carried authority, but within the cabin every movement seemed magnified, every second stretched. The hum of the engines sounded louder, a low vibration running under the leather floors, as if the plane itself sensed the tension. Talia, now breathing slowly, glanced around, noticing the subtle glances of the passengers who had recorded the incident. Some avoided her gaze, ashamed. Others whispered to neighbors expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. The young woman with the TikTok account in row 3 kept her phone discreetly raised, capturing the moment, but lowering the volume of her voice to avoid drawing attention. Comments were already streaming, live viewers growing by the minute. David Greene remained standing, his posture deliberate, eyes never leaving the cabin scene. "Every action here will be observed. Any false steps will be accounted for," he murmured under his breath. His mind raced, calculating legal ramifications, potential viral consequences, and the long-term implications for both the airline and the crew involved. He had dealt with hostile boardrooms and high-stakes mergers, but this was different. The stakes were personal, immediate, and morally undeniable. Brenda Miller moved to the side, visibly shaken. Her hand clutched the intercom phone, but she didn't dial. The realization had sunk in. The power she assumed was absolute had vanished in the presence of David Greene. Her lips quivered slightly as she adjusted the folds of her uniform, an unconscious attempt at composure. A passenger near the rear, a retired judge from New Jersey, whispered under his breath, "I've never seen authority enforced like that outside a courtroom." His eyes flicked nervously toward David, who now surveyed the cabin as if mapping every action, every expression. The retired judge straightened, realizing that in this moment, the social hierarchy of wealth, race, and position had been realigned in the span of seconds. Talia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it, focusing on the gentle, grounding pressure of her father's hand on hers. David's presence was steadying a tether against the chaotic storm of judgment and fear that had gripped her. She took a slow inhale, the faint scent of the cabin's leather, and the antiseptic-like polish grounding her. Her pulse gradually slowed, but the tremor in her hands reminded her of the earlier pain, the suffocating pressure, the panic that had nearly overwhelmed her lungs. "Is she stable?" David asked, not raising his voice, but cutting through the cabin's tension like a knife. The young flight attendant nodded. "She's steady now. Her inhaler is within reach. No further complications." David's eyes scanned the remaining crew members. The veteran attendants avoided eye contact, their pride and authority shattered by the presence of a man whose power extended far beyond the immediate scenario. The passengers shifted again. A man in his 60s wearing a conservative three-piece suit raised his eyebrows, whispering, "That man. He doesn't even need to speak for everyone to know he's in charge." Beside him, a retired school teacher clutched her purse tighter, murmuring, "That girl and her father. Justice in real time." Phones clicked. Cameras panned, subtly capturing the new dynamic power. Restored assumptions overturned. David finally lowered himself into the adjacent jump seat, still observing, still calculating. "We will continue monitoring this flight. Any attempt to escalate or intimidate will be documented. Every detail matters." His voice was soft but carried authority, and the subtle weight behind it caused even the most skeptical passengers to shift uneasily. A cabin supervisor arriving just after the initial incident stepped carefully into the first-class aisle. Her clipboard was firm in her hands, but her eyes betrayed apprehension. "Sir, everything is under control?" she asked, voice measured. David nodded slightly. "Yes. Ensure the crew follows protocol and keeps the passenger safe." "No further misjudgment," she nodded, understanding the gravity, and moved to relay instructions without interference. Meanwhile, Talia's gaze wandered briefly to the other passengers, noting the quiet exchanges the elderly couple, passing discreet glances the middle-aged businessman lowering his tablet to observe the young woman adjusting her phone. Each subtle gesture reflected a collective acknowledgement. What had occurred was not merely a confrontation over a seat. It was a revelation of bias, authority, and justice. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway. The engines hummed steadily, a low vibration underfoot, synchronizing with the rhythm of the passengers' cautious breaths. Outside, the tarmac glistened with the sheen of recent rain, reflecting the amber glow of airport lights. Every reflective surface in the cabin, polished trays, overhead compartments, windows caught fragments of the scene, multiplying the effect, emphasizing the drama. David's gaze lingered on his daughter. Her chest rose and fell, her hair slightly mussed, but her eyes clear and focused. He leaned in, whispering, "You were strong. They will remember this. You will not be underestimated again." Talia nodded, the tension in her shoulders, easing fractionally, the weight of humiliation beginning to lift. The flight attendant who had instigated the confrontation remained near the galley, silent hands clasped. She realized that the assumptions she had relied upon, the idea that appearances dictated authority, had been shattered in front of dozens of witnesses, and every gesture was being recorded, every word remembered. As the plane accelerated, picking up speed on the runway, a final hush fell over the cabin. The subtle roar of the engines filled the space. The narrative had shifted. The authority of fear had been replaced by the authority of truth, presence, and action. The passengers felt it, the crew felt it, and Talia felt it more than anyone else. Outside, the horizon of New York's skyline stretched like a promise, streaked with the last light of dusk. Inside, Talia Greene exhaled fully for the first time since boarding. Her father's hand remained steady over hers, a reminder of protection power, and the unspoken lesson judgment based on assumptions can be overturned. But it takes vigilance, courage, and the right authority in the right moment. As the aircraft lifted into the darkening sky, the cabin settled into a tense, controlled calm. The story of what had just transpired was already being whispered, captured, and recorded, destined to ripple far beyond the fuselage. The first chapter of reckoning had closed, but the air was thick with the knowledge that this was only the beginning, that the full measure of justice and authority would unfold with the clarity of flight and the precision of consequence. Talia's eyes met her father's one last time before looking out the window, absorbing the city below. The lights sparkling like distant stars. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't merely a teen caught in circumstance. She was a witness, a participant, and a survivor of a moment where human error, prejudice, and authority collided and was definitively corrected. The cabin had barely settled when the intercom buzzed, a subtle tension threading through the soft hum of the engines. Talia Greene still gripped her inhaler loosely in her pocket, though she no longer needed it. Her father's hand remained lightly on her shoulder, a tether to stability in a cabin that still felt charged with residual fear. The flight attendants moved with measured restraint now, but every glance, every twitch betrayed their lingering unease. "Captain Sterling to first-class cabin. Please report to the galley immediately." The voice crackled over the intercom. David's eyes narrowed. He hadn't requested the captain himself, but the sudden announcement suggested that the airline's higher-ups were already aware, scrambling to contain a situation that had quickly spiraled beyond their control. The steward nearest Talia stepped forward, murmuring, "Sir, they want to talk to you." David shook his head. "Not yet. Let them realize the weight of their missteps." A hush fell over the cabin. Passengers, many of them seasoned business travelers or retired executives, instinctively straightened in their seats. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the kind that makes the hum of engines fade into a background of suspense. A few elderly women whispered to one another, clutching handbags, while a man in his 70s, a former banker from Chicago, shifted uncomfortably, sensing that what was happening exceeded the ordinary disruptions he had witnessed in decades of travel. Brenda Miller, the lead flight attendant, moved toward the galley with slow, deliberate steps. Her face betrayed a tight mixture of fear and pride, a realization that authority had slipped from her hands, and that the narrative she had relied upon for decades was unraveling. Officer Jim Miller. The air marshal stood near the front. Fists clenched, jaw tight, aware that his actions against Talia were now under scrutiny in ways he could never have anticipated. David Greene finally spoke, his voice low, but commanding, carrying over the subdued murmurs. Everyone remains calm. No one moves unless instructed, and no one records further until this matter is resolved appropriately. Even his words, measured as they were sent, ripples through the crew. The marshal shifted slightly, realizing that any further misstep would be documented and used against him. A young flight attendant, barely 27, approached David, cautiously holding a small tablet. "Sir, the airline wants confirmation that all protocols are being followed," she said, her voice steady, but betraying a tremor. David's gaze lifted to meet hers, assessing measuring. "Protocols. They were broken before we boarded. Now the correction begins. Notify the captain that he will be briefed on the full sequence of events, but only after the immediate safety and welfare of my daughter is secured." Talia's eyes scanned the cabin. The passengers closest to the incident had their devices raised, capturing footage, whispering, noting every subtle exchange. A retired schoolteacher in row 4 muttered to her companion, "I've never seen such control from a parent. From a human being, really." Her companion nodded, eyes wide. "That girl, she's not alone in this. And it's remarkable." Outside the cabin windows, the tarmac lights flickered under a light drizzle, the reflection of neon signage and airport floodlights dancing across the polished fuselage. Inside, the air was charged. Each movement amplified: the scrape of a shoe against the aisle, the slight click of a clasp, the soft hum of an overhead vent. The cabin felt smaller, the tension denser, like a courtroom awaiting testimony. A mid-level airline supervisor, Gregory Shaw, entered the galley, clipboard in hand. Expression unreadable, but body language rigid. "Sir, we need to establish control before departure," he said, glancing at David. David's eyes swept the cabin. "Control is not established by intimidation or assumptions. It is established by justice and procedure. Let us proceed accordingly." The supervisor nodded slowly, noting the authority in David's posture, the weight of consequence behind his calm voice. Talia shifted slightly, feeling the lingering sting of the zip ties on her wrists. Her inhaler was within reach, but she didn't need it now. She had learned to regulate her breath, to steady her pulse, to remain composed, even when the air felt as thin as panic. She caught a glance from a young couple seated in row 3. Their hands hovered over their phones, ready to record, but their eyes held respect, a recognition that this girl was not merely a teen caught in circumstance. She was at the center of a reckoning that exceeded the cabin's 4 walls. Brenda Miller approached the galley with tentative steps, her uniform neat but wrinkled from the earlier flurry of movement. "Sir," she began, voice measured, "the cabin crew has been briefed. We will follow instructions." David nodded once. "Good. Ensure that everyone who witnessed the incident understands their role now. There will be no further escalation, no intimidation, no misrepresentation of facts." "Do you understand?" She swallowed hard, a shiver running through her. "Yes, sir." Officer Jim Miller's eyes flicked toward David, then to Talia. His chest rose and fell unevenly. The subtle weight of accountability settled on him. He had acted under protocol, he told himself, but the interpretation had been disastrous. A pause hung in the air as David's gaze sharpened. Any deviation from lawful procedure from here on will be treated as a direct violation of civil and federal statutes. Do not test this." The passengers murmured quietly, a ripple of tension moving through the cabin. Some reached for their phones. Others leaned back, realizing the gravity of what they had witnessed. A woman in her 60s, wearing a tweed coat and pearls, whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. She's a child, and yet—" She trailed off, eyes wide as she caught the measured calm radiating from David Greene. Talia exhaled slowly, her eyes following her father as he moved to the aisle, hands folded behind his back. Every step he took carried weight, measured precision. He paused midway, glancing back at her, conveying a silent promise, "You are safe, and this will not be forgotten." The cabin seemed to pulse with awareness, each observer registering the shift of authority, the reversal of assumptions. Suddenly the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but precise. "Flight crew, please stand by. We have a situation in first class that requires my attention before takeoff." The cabin went still. Even the hum of the engines seemed to quiet the passengers' collective focus, converging on the galley, on David, on the girl whose courage had ignited a moment of reckoning. David leaned down slightly, speaking just above a whisper to Talia. "We'll handle this together. Stay composed. Let them see respect isn't given. It's earned." She nodded, the tension in her body easing fractionally. The awareness that the world was watching, that every action was recorded, hung over them like a storm cloud waiting to break. Gregory Shaw approached, holding the tablet with a precise professional air. "Sir, the airline requires that we review all documentation and witness statements before departure." David's eyes met his. "Documentation will be reviewed. Witnesses will be heard. But first, my daughter's welfare is paramount. Nothing else proceeds until she is secure and calm." Talia's gaze swept the cabin, noting every whisper, every click of a phone, the subtle rearrangement of passengers shifting uneasily in their seats. The young flight attendant from earlier remained at her side, hands clasped, eyes darting, unsure how to balance protocol with the palpable authority David wielded effortlessly. Outside, rain glistened on the tarmac, streaking across the airport lights. The plane's engines purred beneath them, ready to thrust into the sky. Yet the cabin felt suspended. Time stretched taut, every movement, every word heavy with consequence. David stood near the aisle, motionless, as though the air itself bent around him, commanding respect and acknowledgement of the gravity of the moment. Then a soft beep from Talia's phone reminded her of the outside world messages from her coding mentors, updates from the scholarship committee. But she ignored it. Her focus was entirely on the cabin, on the subtle recalibration of power, on the careful orchestration of justice and authority. The cabin doors had sealed, the engines hummed steadily, but for the occupants of first class, nothing had truly returned to normal. The incident, the assumptions, the misuse of authority, it had left a mark. And yet in that quiet, electric pause before takeoff, one truth was undeniable. The misjudgment of a child had been corrected, the weight of authority had shifted, and the consequences were just beginning to ripple outward. David Greene moved back toward his daughter, kneeling slightly. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked, voice steady. eyes locked on hers. Talia nodded. The engines roared as the plane began taxiing, the cabin still buzzing with tension. The first steps of accountability had begun, but the full measure of justice, the confrontation with the flawed authority that had almost harmed her, was yet to unfold. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some murmuring, some gripping devices recording, absorbing. The first-class cabin, once a sanctuary of calm and order, had become a stage. And on that stage a father and daughter had redefined the rules, one measured deliberate action at a time. The plane leveled off above the Atlantic, the city lights of New York fading into a hazy ribbon behind them. Talia Greene pressed her palms to the armrests, feeling the subtle vibrations of the engines through her fingers. She was exhausted, her chest still tight from the earlier struggle. Yet her mind was alert, scanning every detail in the cabin. Her father, David Greene, sat beside her posture. Rigid eyes, sweeping the rows like a predator, assessing territory. Every passenger, every crew member was under scrutiny, and the weight of their judgment pressed heavily on the cabin air. Brenda Miller remained near the galley, her hands clasped in front of her face, pale under the fluorescent lights. She avoided eye contact with David, her lips pressed together as though forming words she could not summon. Officer Jim Miller lingered near the front, shifting his weight uneasily, aware that every move, every breath he took was now measured against consequences far beyond his previous authority. Dad Talia whispered voice, soft but steady. What happens if they try to escalate? Again. David's hand brushed hers, a grounding gesture, a reminder that power and control had shifted. They won't. Not with me here. They will follow procedure, or they'll answer to far greater authority than the airline. But stay alert. Some people still react before they think. His gaze moved toward Brenda, whose trembling hands betrayed her internal panic. In row 2, a retired couple from Boston whispered among themselves, their eyes flicking nervously from Talia to her father. "Did you see the way he just stared at them?" the woman murmured. Her husband nodded. "That's not just a parent protecting his kid. That's a man who knows exactly what he can and will do." Their attention was rapt, but they dared not speak too loudly. Around them, a few business travelers subtly angled their phones, capturing the tension their murmurs, forming a soft chorus of realization that authority had been redefined in this cabin. The steward who had assisted Talia earlier moved closer, glancing at David. "Sir, the passengers are uneasy. Some are asking if the airline will respond formally." David's lips pressed into a thin line. "Let them be uneasy. What matters is that the truth is clear. Every action, every misstep is being observed. We will make sure this does not repeat." Suddenly, a chime from the galley intercom broke the relative calm. "Cabin crew report to the cockpit for a mandatory briefing." Brenda stiffened, glancing toward David. He tilted his head slightly, watching, calculating. The implication was clear. The airline management had become aware of the incident and wanted to contain the fallout. But in the presence of a Greene, even senior management had to tread carefully. Talia exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing slightly. She had felt the worst moments of fear and humiliation, but now she sensed the control returning. The air in the cabin was taut with anticipation, like a coiled spring. Yet beneath that tension was a quiet order, established by authority, that could not be challenged without consequence. She glanced at the passengers around her, noting the subtle shifts in posture. The lowered heads, the hesitant glances toward her father. Respect, once assumed to be earned through compliance, was now demanded through presence. Brenda Miller moved to the rear of the cabin, muttering under her breath, trying to regain composure. Officer Miller's jaw tightened as he watched a simmering sense of humiliation evident in the set of his shoulders. Neither dared make a misstep, knowing that David Greene's presence carried a weight far beyond immediate protocol. The young flight attendant who had quietly assisted Talia earlier approached again, holding a notepad with meticulous attention. "Sir, I've documented the incident and compiled witness statements from the passengers who observed the situation. Do you want me to submit them directly to the airline's executive office?" David glanced at the pages briefly, eyes narrowing. "Yes. Every detail, every second, every reaction. Make sure it's comprehensive. Accuracy is crucial. This isn't just about what happened here. It's about setting a precedent." In the cabin, murmurs continued to circulate. A woman in her late 60s, a retired social worker, leaned forward to whisper to a companion, "I've seen authority abused before, but he's correcting it without raising his voice. It's remarkable." Her companion nodded, adjusting her pearl necklace eyes, fixed on the father-daughter duo. The quiet consensus was forming among passengers. The power dynamics of this flight had shifted irreversibly. David's attention returned to Talia. "We need to prepare for the next step," he said quietly. "The airline will attempt to deflect responsibility to reframe the narrative. We must be ready to respond, to ensure that truth remains visible." Talia nodded, understanding fully. She had been tested, nearly broken, and now she would witness her father leverage authority with precision, teaching a lesson in accountability, visibility, and consequence. The galley intercom buzzed again. "Captain Sterling to cabin. Please report any incidents immediately." David's eyes flicked to the speaker. The captain's tone was clipped but cautious, reflecting the uncertainty of having authority challenged in real time by a passenger with legal and corporate power. David leaned back slightly, observing the subtle shifts in the crew's posture, noting which actions were born of fear and which were instinctual protocol. Talia adjusted her seatbelt, feeling the familiar pressure of security straps across her torso. The flight had now transitioned from a standard journey into a tableau of social dynamics, authority, and moral judgment. Every passenger was a witness, every phone a potential amplifier, every gesture a recorded statement. The hum of the engines blended with the subtle rustle of papers, the quiet clicks of phone cameras, and the soft breathing of those tense with observation. A steward approached, discreetly lowering his voice. "Sir, I have coordinated with a few passengers willing to provide statements if required. They have agreed to verify the sequence of events." David nodded, appreciating the initiative. "Good. Witness credibility is vital. Ensure that their observations are captured accurately and discreetly. No embellishment." Brenda Miller lingered near the galley fingers, tapping nervously against the counter. She could feel the magnitude of her misjudgment pressing down. The assumptions she had relied upon, child in hoodie, perceived threat, automatic authority, had all been overturned. She understood painfully that she had underestimated both a child and the force of parental power guided by corporate authority. The intercom buzzed once more, signaling the captain's approach. A tense silence settled. David's eyes scanned the cabin one last time, catching the subtle gestures of the passengers. Tilted heads, widened eyes, cautious whispers. He recognized each movement as an element of the story, unfolding beyond the immediate events. Documentation, perception, viral potential. Dad Talia whispered, voice tight with anticipation. What if they try to misrepresent what happened once we land? David's hand tightened slightly over hers. Then we let the evidence speak. Every recording, every witness, every document, they cannot escape the truth, and we will ensure they answer for every choice they made. The engines thrummed louder as the plane adjusted altitude, the cabin lights reflecting off polished surfaces and passengers' faces. The moment hung suspended, a cinematic pause where authority, morality, and justice intersected in real time. Outside the Atlantic, stretched endlessly, lights from ships and distant cities glimmering like stars beneath a darkened sky. Inside the first-class cabin had become a crucible of consequence, observation, and accountability. David Greene finally leaned back, letting his eyes sweep the cabin slowly. Each flight attendant, each air marshal, each passenger had been measured, catalogued, and now understood their position within the new hierarchy established in these minutes. Talia, her breathing finally steady, caught his gaze and felt a profound sense of safety, authority, and respect restored. The captain's voice came again over the intercom, clipped and formal. Cabin crew, ensure all passengers are settled and prepare for continuous monitoring of this flight. Report any irregularities immediately. The subtle authority behind the words was a recognition that the previous disruption had been extraordinary, and that the enforcement of proper protocol was now under scrutiny, like never before. Talia's eyes swept the cabin one last time before turning to the window. The city lights of Boston had vanished beneath the clouds, the Atlantic stretching dark and infinite. Her father's presence remained at her side, a shield and a statement. The story was far from over, but the first wave of justice had been secured. The narrative once skewed by assumption and prejudice had been reclaimed, and for the first time since boarding, she allowed herself a slow, deliberate breath. Every passenger had seen it. Every device had recorded it. Every gesture would be remembered. The flight continued, engines steady. But the echoes of what had transpired, the tension, the fear, the authority challenged and restored, would resonate far beyond the cabin. Talia, small but unbroken, understood now the weight of observation, the power of truth, and the unmistakable force of a father's unwavering presence. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the cabin, but Talia Greene hardly noticed. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, still tingling from the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins earlier. The memory of the zip ties, a faint, painful echo. David Greene remained at her side, a pillar of composure, his eyes scanning the cabin. Calculating every potential risk, every passenger reaction, every subtle movement of the crew. The hum of the engines was steady now, a constant vibration beneath the leather floors, but it did little to soothe the tension that still lingered in the first-class cabin. Brenda Miller stood near the forward galley, lips pressed tight, hands trembling ever so slightly. She avoided the eyes of the passengers around her, aware that any glance could betray the magnitude of her earlier misjudgment. Officer Jim Miller remained near the front, rigid and defensive, acutely conscious that his previous decisions had been overturned in front of a room full of witnesses and cameras. He clenched his fists subtly, the weight of accountability settling onto him like a physical burden. David Greene leaned slightly toward Talia, whispering, "They'll follow now, but stay aware. Any misstep, and we document immediately." She nodded, swallowing chest rising slowly as she tried to regulate her breathing. Her inhaler was within reach, untouched, a quiet reminder of the vulnerability she had just endured. The father-daughter dynamic was taut with unspoken understanding the gravity of the earlier incident, settling over them both like a shadow. The flight attendants moved cautiously, communicating in low tones, ensuring that passengers' needs were met without provoking further conflict. The younger steward, who had assisted Talia earlier, glanced toward David for guidance, aware that any misjudgment could result in serious repercussions. He adjusted the service cart with careful precision, his hands steady, but eyes flicking repeatedly toward the Greene duo. A few rows back, passengers whispered among themselves. A retired lawyer in his 70s adjusted his glasses' eyes, narrowing at the tableau unfolding in front of him. "I've seen courtrooms handle matters with less tension," he murmured to his companion, a retired nurse clutching a small notebook. "That father, he's not just protecting his daughter, he's setting a precedent. People are watching." His companion nodded, eyes wide, pen poised to record impressions for posterity. In the galley, Brenda Miller moved toward the service area, gesturing subtly for Officer Miller to maintain distance. Her fingers traced the edge of the countertop, a nervous tick she couldn't quite suppress. The realization that authority had shifted completely was settling in. She had underestimated both a child and her father, and the weight of that error pressed down upon her with relentless clarity. David Greene's eyes scanned the cabin again, noting small details that most would overlook: the slight shift of a passenger's hand, the subtle tap of a phone recording the scene, the unguarded expressions of the crew members. Every reaction was a piece of data, a measure of compliance and recognition of authority. He whispered to Talia, "Notice everything, every movement, every hesitation. They will be accountable." Talia's gaze traveled along the rows of seats. A young tech worker in row 3 held a smartphone, discreetly capturing footage of the incident with a quiet, almost reverent focus. Nearby, a retired couple whispered observations, subtle nods, acknowledging the correctness of her position, their understanding bridging decades of life experience with the clarity of the moment. Even in silence, they were witnesses to the moral gravity of the situation. David Greene adjusted his posture slightly, the fabric of his grey suit shifting without a sound. His presence alone had altered the dynamic of the cabin, transforming the previously tense air into a space of controlled authority. The crew knew instinctively that further misjudgment would carry immediate consequences. Even the captain's voice over the intercom, calm and clipped, betrayed an awareness that the situation had escalated far beyond a standard seating dispute. Talia's breathing had slowed, but her pulse remained elevated, a reminder of the near crisis she had endured. She glanced at the young steward who had assisted her. "Thank you," she whispered softly. He nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and awe. He had witnessed a small person assert her rights in the face of authority, guided by a parent whose presence radiated control and power. Brenda Miller, still near the galley, raised her hand slightly as if to speak, but stopped herself, lips pressing together. Her mind raced, cataloguing the errors she had made, the assumptions she had relied upon, the humiliation she had endured. She realized that the eyes of the cabin and the world beyond were now on her, judging her not just for her actions, but for the assumptions that had led to them. Officer Miller's jaw tightened. He had followed protocol, or so he believed, but the presence of David Greene reframed every action. He shifted his stance, hands hovering near his belt, aware that any further interaction with Talia could be construed as aggression or negligence. He could feel the weight of accountability, the implicit understanding that the narrative had irrevocably changed. David Greene's gaze swept the cabin once more, lingering briefly on each crew member. "Every action matters," he whispered to Talia. "They will answer for this, but we proceed carefully. Observation first. Correction second. No escalation unless absolutely necessary." Talia nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around her inhaler, a reminder of the physical vulnerability she had survived and the mental vigilance she would now carry. The flight continued in a delicate balance. Passengers adjusted subtly, some leaning forward, others hiding devices, but clearly observing each, aware that the previous events had shattered the assumptions they held about authority, race, and entitlement. A retired judge muttered softly to his companion, "This is extraordinary. They've recalibrated the hierarchy of this cabin, with nothing but presence and observation." Outside the Atlantic stretched endlessly, a dark expanse under the fading light of dusk. The engines hummed steadily, a soft vibration coursing through the fuselage, grounding the cabin in its mechanical rhythm. Inside the first-class section remained taut with anticipation. The memory of the zip tie, the sharp commands, and the sudden appearance of authority, lingering like a shadow over polished leather and sparkling cutlery. David Greene finally leaned back slightly, allowing a small exhale, though his eyes never left the cabin. "The next step is preparation," he murmured. "The airline will attempt to reframe the story once we land. Documentation is crucial. Witnesses' recordings, every detail, they must remain intact." He glanced at Talia. "Understand, every detail matters. This is more than a flight. This is accountability in real time." Talia absorbed his words, the weight of responsibility pressing lightly on her shoulders. She realized that this was no longer just about a seat or even about her asthma. It was about the integrity of truth, the assertion of rights, and the demonstration that authority could be challenged and corrected even in a confined space, high above the ocean. Brenda Miller shifted her weight a nervous tick, betraying her unease. Officer Miller adjusted his stance, the subtle stiffness in his shoulders, a reflection of the mental recalibration required when authority is unexpectedly confronted. The cabin had become a stage for judgment, observation, and accountability, and every person in that space, willing or not, was a participant. David Greene's voice dropped lower, nearly a whisper, but every word carried weight. "Maintain composure. Observe. Do not intervene unless necessary. Witnesses' recordings, statements, all of it will hold weight. Every misstep will have consequence." Talia nodded, chest rising and falling steadily, a quiet affirmation of understanding and readiness. The engines roared slightly as the plane ascended further, the hum merging with the rhythmic pulse of tension in the cabin. Passengers adjusted, some whispering, some leaning slightly forward, their attention fixed on the father and daughter. The narrative had shifted. The assumptions that had fueled the initial confrontation had been undone, replaced with an awareness that authority, when wielded wisely and with presence, could recalibrate perception and command respect. David Greene finally placed his hand lightly on Talia's shoulder. We move forward now, calm, measured. Everything from this point on is documentation and control. Remember, they will attempt to spin this. We must remain unyielding in truth and presence. Talia's eyes swept the cabin one last time before turning to the window, the lights of distant ships glimmering far below. She realized fully in that suspended cinematic moment that she had survived more than an encounter with a misjudged authority. She had become the center of a lesson in accountability, fairness, and vigilance. And with her father by her side, she knew that the next chapter, whatever challenges it might hold, would be faced with clarity, power, and purpose. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled at cruising altitude, but the tension in first class did not fade. Talia Greene sat upright, her fingers brushing over the zip-tied marks on her wrists, faintly red but healing. She was exhausted, her body still reacting to the adrenaline that had surged through her just hours before. Her father, David Greene, remained alert, beside her eyes, scanning the rows, noting every subtle movement, every nervous glance. The hum of the engines beneath them was steady, yet it did nothing to calm the charged atmosphere. Brenda Miller stood near the forward galley, her hands folded tightly in front of her jaw set. The earlier confrontation had stripped her of the air of control she had taken for granted for decades. Her face was pale under the cabin lights, and the sweat at her temple reflected her awareness that her authority had been completely undermined. Officer Jim Miller, the air marshal, lingered by the bulkhead, shifting uneasily, the weight of accountability pressing on him like an unseen hand. David Greene leaned toward Talia, lowering his voice but keeping his eyes on the crew. They will follow now, but stay vigilant. Watch for any attempt to reassert dominance. Document everything. Talia nodded, her breathing slow and steady. The inhaler remained in her pocket, a comfort she didn't yet need. She observed the passengers as well. Many had their phones poised, discreetly capturing the aftermath, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and admiration. A young flight attendant, barely 26, approached cautiously holding a notepad. "Sir, should I continue compiling witness statements from passengers who observed the incident?" David glanced at him, eyes calculating. "Yes. Every detail matters: who said what, who moved, the exact timing of each action. Make sure nothing is omitted or altered." The steward nodded, aware that his role had shifted from mere service to crucial documentation. The intercom buzzed. "First class cabin, please report any further incidents immediately." David's gaze flicked toward the speaker, noting the clipped tone. The airline's management was monitoring, but the father and daughter commanded the space. Every crew member now understood the unspoken rule: misjudgment would no longer go unchallenged. Talia shifted slightly, feeling the subtle vibrations from the engines through the floor. She glanced at the passengers near her. A retired schoolteacher and her husband had lowered their tablets and phones, leaning forward, eyes wide. "That father," the woman whispered, "he's not just a parent. He's teaching a lesson in authority and integrity." The man nodded, adjusting his glasses. "I've seen CEOs run companies, but rarely like this real-time accountability perfectly executed. Brenda Miller moved to the rear of the cabin, glancing at the passengers. Her fingers traced the seams of her uniform, absent-mindedly, a nervous tick betraying her inner turmoil. She realized that the assumptions she had relied upon child in hoodie, perceived threat, automatic authority, had all been dismantled. Every step she had taken, every order she had given, had been measured and recorded, and now the consequences would be far-reaching. Officer Jim Miller adjusted his stance, feeling the shift in the cabin. His previous actions, justified by protocol in his mind, now carried a heavy weight of public scrutiny. The realization that his authority had been questioned and corrected by a parent in the presence of dozens of witnesses and cameras was humbling. He clenched his fists, subtly aware that any further movement could exacerbate the situation. David Greene stood slowly, his posture precise, movements deliberate. His eyes swept the cabin, cataloguing each passenger crew member and their reactions. "Observe and report," he murmured to Talia. "Any misrepresentation, any misstep is recorded. We are not here to escalate unnecessarily, but we will not tolerate further injustice." Talia nodded, absorbing the gravity of his words, understanding fully the balance between vigilance and restraint. The passengers shifted subtly, sensing the gravity of the moment. A man in his 60s, a retired executive from Chicago, whispered to his companion, "This isn't just a flight incident. This is accountability in motion. Every decision, every glance will be remembered." His companion, a former nurse, nodded, her eyes fixed on the Greene duo. Even in silence, the cabin was aware that something extraordinary was unfolding. David Greene moved toward the aisle, signaling subtly for the steward to stand by. "We will handle any further disturbances with precision," he said under his breath. "No rash actions, no assumptions. Every measure of authority must be deliberate, observed, and accountable." Talia's eyes followed his movements, the confidence and control in his posture providing a steadying anchor. The galley intercom buzzed again, a soft, deliberate chime. "Cabin crew report immediately to the cockpit." David's eyes flicked toward the speaker, noting the airline's attempt to assert oversight. He allowed a small, controlled exhale. "Let them come. Every move will be visible, every choice measured. This is not merely observation. This is a demonstration of accountability in action." Talia's focus shifted to the cabin itself. She observed the subtle gestures, the hesitant lowering of a phone, the furtive glance exchanged between two passengers, the tightening of lips on crew members who had once felt untouchable. Every subtle cue reinforced the new hierarchy. Power, once assumed, had been challenged and recalibrated. Brenda Miller remained near the galley voice, soft as she muttered to herself, "I didn't know." Her hands trembled, fingers clenching and unclenching as she realized that the assumptions she had taken for granted, the idea that appearances dictated authority, had been completely dismantled. Every recording, every whispered observation had captured her misjudgment. Officer Miller's jaw tightened, his shoulders stiff. He had executed protocol, yes, but the consequences of misjudgment were now undeniable. The weight of scrutiny pressed down, and the subtle shift of authority had placed him on notice. Even a subtle misstep could be documented and held against him. David Greene returned to his daughter's side, kneeling slightly. "Ready for what comes next?" he asked, voice low, measured. Talia nodded, understanding that this was only the beginning. The plane continued its steady hum, engines vibrating beneath them. Yet the cabin felt like a suspended moment between consequence and action, the air heavy with observation. Passengers adjusted, some leaning slightly forward, others watching quietly. The realization settled in the authority that had initially seemed absolute had been redefined. The assumptions, the misjudgments, the overreaches, they were now visible, undeniable, and documented. Talia, small and still, recognized that she had witnessed not only the correction of injustice, but also the careful, deliberate orchestration of accountability. The intercom buzzed one final time, soft but deliberate. Cabin crew continue monitoring and report any irregularities. David's gaze swept the cabin, noting each subtle movement, each slight adjustment. Observe, document, and maintain order. Any attempt to distort the facts will be recorded and addressed. Talia's eyes scanned the passengers once more. Even those who had been passive observers now understood that they had witnessed authority, corrected a lesson in power, justice, and vigilance unfolding in real time. As the plane cruised over the Atlantic, the horizon a ribbon of dark water dotted with distant lights. David Greene remained alert beside his daughter, his posture rigid, eyes unwavering. Talia exhaled slowly, chest rising and falling steadily, finally allowing herself a measure of calm. The zip-tied marks on her wrists were a fading memory. But the lesson they carried, the recognition of power, the assertion of rights, and the presence of authority remained vividly etched in her mind. The first-class cabin, once merely a place of comfort and luxury, had transformed into a crucible of accountability, observation, and ethical reckoning. Each passenger crew member and subtle gesture now existed within a web of consequence that could not be ignored. Talia, small but resolute, recognized the full weight of what had transpired. The immediate danger had passed, but the narrative, the observation, and the assertion of justice were only beginning to ripple outward, destined to reach far beyond the confines of the aircraft. David Greene placed a steady hand on Talia's shoulder. "We move forward carefully," he said. "Every detail, every witness, every recording, they will matter once we land. This is more than a flight. It is a precedent." Talia nodded, feeling the full gravity of her father's presence, the safety it provided, and the power it wielded quietly but decisively over everyone in the cabin. The engines hummed, the cabin settled, but the tension, the awareness, and the lessons lingered. Every movement, every glance, every whisper had been part of a tableau of authority, observation, and consequence. Talia understood now that this flight had become a turning point, not just for her, but for every assumption and every misstep that had nearly cost her everything. The horizon stretched endlessly outside, but inside the landscape of justice and accountability had already been redrawn. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, a steady rhythm beneath the tension that still lingered like a shadow over the first-class seats. Talia Greene sat upright, fingers lightly brushing the fading red marks on her wrists, her inhaler still untouched. The adrenaline had subsided enough for her to recognize the exhaustion in her limbs, but her mind remained sharp, every nerve alert. David Greene remained beside her, eyes sweeping the rows with precise calculation, a quiet authority radiating from his posture that no one dared challenge. Brenda Miller lingered near the forward galley, her uniform impeccably pressed, but her composure frayed at the edges. Each time she glanced at Talia or David, a shiver ran through her, a recognition that the power she had assumed was hers by protocol had been thoroughly dismantled. Officer Jim Miller shifted uneasily near the bulkhead, his jaw tight, hands clenching at his sides. The memory of the zip ties, the misjudgment, and the viral recording weighed on him, a constant, unrelenting reminder that authority could be questioned and overturned even in a confined cabin high above the Atlantic. David Greene leaned slightly toward Talia, voice low, precise. They're watching. Every move, every reaction is being recorded. Remain calm. Any provocation now will be met with controlled response. Talia nodded, exhaling slowly, her chest rising and falling in a rhythm she fought to maintain. She glanced at the passengers near her, some of them still holding their phones, capturing the aftermath. Their expressions ranged from awe to disbelief, a silent acknowledgement that the hierarchy in the cabin had shifted irrevocably. A steward approached young, barely 27, holding a tablet. "Sir, I've compiled the witness accounts from passengers who observed the incident. Shall I submit them to the airline headquarters once we land?" David Greene's eyes met his. "Yes. Every detail from the first verbal exchange to the zip tie application. No embellishment, no omission. Accuracy is critical. This is not only about Talia's experience, it is about the precedent set for all future passengers and crew." Brenda Miller's hands clenched involuntarily, her pulse quickening as she listened from the galley. She understood now that every action, every hesitation, every misjudged glance she had given to a 17-year-old girl was being catalogued, observed, and would be scrutinized beyond the reach of this flight. Her authority, once absolute in the cabin, now felt like fragile glass in the presence of David Greene's unwavering presence. Officer Miller's shoulders stiffened as he observed the father and daughter. He had trained for decades to maintain control, to enforce protocol, yet the sequence of events had proven that procedural authority alone could be powerless when confronted by a parent with legal, corporate, and personal power. He shifted slightly, knowing that any further misstep could have severe consequences both professionally and legally. The passengers' reactions were subtle but telling. A retired judge in row 3 leaned forward, slightly murmuring to his companion, "I've seen courtroom authority exercised, but rarely with such quiet precision and impact." His companion, a former teacher, nodded, eyes wide. The lesson isn't just for the crew. It's for everyone in this cabin. Assumptions and appearances can mislead, but presence and truth hold weight. David Greene's gaze swept the cabin again, noting every micro-expression. The young flight attendant who had discreetly assisted Talia shifted slightly, unsure whether to maintain her previous protocol or defer entirely to Greene's presence. He whispered under his breath, "Observe document and maintain order. Only intervene if absolutely necessary." Talia absorbed his instructions, her own eyes scanning the cabin for any signs of residual tension or unspoken hostility. The hum of the engines seemed to synchronize with the cabin's collective pulse, a constant vibration beneath the polished leather and gleaming silver of first class. Outside the Atlantic stretched endlessly dark and infinite, the occasional light from a passing ship reflecting like distant stars on the water's surface. Within the cabin, every movement felt magnified, every whisper carrying significance, every glance subject to scrutiny. David Greene finally stood posture-controlled, every movement deliberate. He walked slowly down the aisle, eyes sweeping the passengers and crew alike. "Let this be clear," he said, his voice low but commanding, carrying effortlessly over the soft murmurings of the cabin. "Any further attempts to intimidate or misrepresent will be documented and addressed with full consequence. Protocol is not an excuse for injustice." Talia's gaze followed him, a mix of awe and steadiness in her eyes. She realized fully that the lesson extended beyond the plane. Authority, when combined with awareness, preparation and restraint, could reshape the assumptions of an entire environment. The presence of power exercised judiciously could correct misjudgments that had seemed absolute moments before. Brenda Miller adjusted her posture, shoulders tight, lips pressed together. The weight of the situation pressed on her with a clarity she had not felt before. Every passenger watching, every device recording, every subtle shift in expression, these were all forces beyond her control. The authority she had once relied upon was now questioned, redefined by observation and by the quiet but undeniable power of a father protecting his child. Officer Miller's hands flexed slightly, the tension radiating from him like a wire under strain. He had acted within the letter of the law, yet the spirit of his actions had been challenged and undone. He realized now that authority is not only about rules and protocols, but also about perception, oversight, and the accountability of every step taken. The captain's voice came over the intercom, clipped and cautious. "Cabin crew continue to monitor passengers. Report any irregularities immediately. Ensure safety protocols are followed without escalation." The subtle authority in the voice indicated awareness of the earlier incident, a recognition that extraordinary oversight was required. David Greene's eyes met the speaker, unflinching, unshaken. Talia's attention returned to the cabin. She observed the subtle glances exchanged between passengers, a retired couple craning forward, young professionals discreetly recording elderly women whispering assessments. The social dynamics had shifted entirely. What had started as a misjudgment based on appearance had evolved into a demonstration of accountability and ethical enforcement in real time. David Greene lowered himself slightly toward Talia, voice calm but firm. "We will handle any remaining concerns with measured precision. No reaction unless necessary. Witnesses' recordings, statements, they will all hold weight. Everything from this point forward is about observation and documentation." Talia nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. She felt the control of the situation settle around her, like a shield, a protection that was both tangible and psychological. The engines thrummed steadily, the aircraft slicing through the clouds above the Atlantic. The subtle vibration underfoot mirrored the rhythm of observation and calculation in the cabin. David Greene's presence was both anchor and warning. Any deviation from fairness, any misstep in judgment would be measured, recorded, and addressed. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some leaning forward, some clutching phones, some exchanging quiet nods. Even those who had remained passive witnesses now understood the shift in authority, the redefinition of power and oversight within the confines of the plane. Talia, small but resilient, recognized fully that she had been more than a passenger. She had been a witness, an observer and a participant in a moment where injustice had been corrected, authority recalibrated, and accountability asserted. David Greene's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "Every detail matters," he whispered. Every gesture, every word, every glance will be part of the record. We are not just passengers. We are witnesses to what accountability looks like in real time. Talia exhaled slowly, letting the tension ebb, understanding that the flight was now more than transportation. It was a lesson, a demonstration, a stage for authority, vigilance and consequence, all unfolding in the quiet hum above the Atlantic. The plane continued onward, engines steady, horizon endless. But inside the cabin, the lesson was complete. Authority is not given. It is recognized, challenged, and when exercised with clarity and purpose, restored in full measure. Talia's eyes met her father's once more. She felt a surge of clarity and strength, knowing that the moment, the observation, and the consequence would echo far beyond the confines of this flight. The cabin was quiet now, but the tension lingered like an electric current beneath the soft hum of the engines. Talia Greene sat upright, fingers brushing lightly against the fading bruises on her wrists, still tender from the zip ties that had bound her. She felt the lingering adrenaline in her limbs, a dull vibration that made her acutely aware of every sound, the gentle click of a folding tray, the subtle rustle of seat belts, the soft murmur of passengers whispering among themselves. David Greene remained at her side. Posture rigid, eyes sweeping the cabin with deliberate precision, calculating and cataloguing each movement, each reaction. Brenda Miller hovered near the galley lips, pressed tight. Hands twitching as though she wanted to speak, but feared the consequences. Her authority, once absolute, had evaporated in the presence of David Greene. She felt exposed, scrutinized not only by him, but by every passenger who had witnessed the earlier events. Officer Jim Miller stood by the forward bulkhead, jaw tight, shoulders stiff, acutely aware that his previous actions had been recorded, scrutinized and challenged. Every breath he took carried the weight of accountability, the awareness that his authority had been tested and found wanting. David Greene leaned slightly toward Talia, voice low, measured, yet carrying a weight that compelled attention. Observe everything, every gesture, every glance, every whisper. Documentation will matter. They will be accountable for any further misstep. Talia nodded, exhaling slowly, feeling the steadiness of his presence anchor her own nerves. The inhaler remained in her pocket, a quiet reminder of her vulnerability. But she did not need it now. The younger steward, who had discreetly assisted Talia earlier, approached holding a tablet with careful hands. "Sir, witness statements from passengers have been compiled. Should I submit them once we land?" David's eyes met his, precise and calculating. "Yes, include every detail, timing, dialogue, facial expressions, gestures. Nothing omitted. Accuracy is paramount. This is not only about what happened on this flight, but about setting a precedent that will ripple beyond these walls." Brenda Miller's fingers flexed nervously, tracing the seams of her uniform. Her mind replayed the confrontation, cataloguing every misjudgment, every assumption she had relied upon. The thought that her actions had been broadcast, recorded and observed made her stomach twist. The authority she had relied upon for years had been dismantled in moments, replaced by the presence of a man whose power extended far beyond the cabin. Officer Miller adjusted his stance, shoulders stiff. He had acted in accordance with protocol, or so he believed, but the weight of moral and social accountability had reframed every action. He realized that authority was not only procedural, it required judgment, perception, and the ability to recognize the limits of one's power. Each subtle movement he made now was scrutinized, and any misstep could carry consequences far beyond the flight. Passengers in the rows nearby whispered to one another, eyes shifting between Talia and her father. A retired judge in row 3 murmured to his companion, "I've presided over cases where authority was challenged, but rarely have I seen it exercised with such quiet force and precision." The companion, a former nurse, nodded eyes wide, noting the subtle control and calm exerted by David Greene. Even in silence, the passengers understood that the social hierarchy of the cabin had been recalibrated. David Greene rose slowly, every movement deliberate. He walked down the aisle, eyes sweeping the cabin, cataloguing the crew and passengers alike. "Let it be clear," he said, voice low, but carrying through the cabin any attempt to intimidate or misrepresent will be documented and addressed. Authority must not be abused. Protocol is not a shield for prejudice. Talia followed his gaze, observing the subtle reactions around her. The young steward, the hesitant glances of passengers, the tight-lipped expressions of the flight attendants, all reflected a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power. What had begun as a misjudgment based on appearance and assumption had transformed into a realignment of authority and accountability. The intercom buzzed softly. "Cabin crew continue monitoring all passengers and report irregularities immediately." David's gaze flicked to the speaker, noting the airline's attempt to regain control. He allowed himself a measured exhale. "Let them come. Every move is recorded. Observation first. Correction second. No escalation unless necessary." Talia's eyes wandered over the cabin, noting the subtle gestures of the passengers. Some held their phones discreetly recording, others exchanged quiet nods of acknowledgement. The retired couple from Boston whispered among themselves, leaning forward slightly. "That father," the woman said, "he isn't just protecting his daughter. He's demonstrating exactly how accountability should function." Her companion nodded, pen poised over a small notebook. "The precision, the control, the calm, that's authority in action." Brenda Miller adjusted her posture, shoulders tense. The awareness that the cabin and every recording device were silently documenting her actions pressed on her like a heavy weight. She had underestimated a teenager, and her assumptions about race appearance and authority had been laid bare for all to see. Every step she took now was measured, tentative, fraught with the memory of her misjudgment. Officer Miller's fingers flexed, knuckles white, as he adjusted his stance. He understood that further action could exacerbate the consequences. His authority had been challenged, undermined, and reframed in moments, and every subtle movement would now be considered evidence of compliance or violation. David Greene returned to his daughter's side, kneeling slightly. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked, voice low, precise. Talia nodded, understanding the full magnitude of the situation. This flight was no longer a simple journey. It had become a test of accountability, perception, and moral authority. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some leaning slightly forward, some whispering, others holding their devices with deliberate subtlety. The cabin had transformed from a place of luxury and comfort into a crucible of observation, ethical reckoning, and recalibrated power. Talia recognized that she was no longer merely a passenger. She was a participant and witness in a moment where injustice had been confronted and corrected. The engines thrummed beneath them, steady and unyielding. Outside the Atlantic, stretched endlessly dark and infinite, dotted with the faint lights of ships far below. The first-class cabin felt suspended in time, each breath, each glance, each subtle gesture amplified. Authority had shifted, and the consequences of prior misjudgments had been laid bare. David Greene placed a steady hand on Talia's shoulder. From this moment forward, every detail matters. Witnesses' recordings, statements, they all carry weight. Observation is now the tool of accountability. Authority is recognized, measured, and corrected when necessary. Talia exhaled slowly, chest rising and falling with deliberate rhythm. She felt the weight of the lesson, the power of the correction, and the certainty that she was no longer vulnerable to assumptions or prejudice. Passengers were quiet now, their attention subtly focused, their reactions restrained but present. The cabin, once a sanctuary of comfort, had become a stage where authority, justice, and consequence played out with precision. Talia understood fully that she had survived more than an immediate threat. She had witnessed a careful, deliberate assertion of ethical power and accountability. The plane hummed steadily, engines vibrating beneath polished leather floors. The Atlantic glimmered far below the horizon, a faint line separating sea and sky. Inside every subtle motion, every whispered word, every glance and click of a phone was part of a larger narrative of observation, consequence, and ethical enforcement. Talia, small but resilient, absorbed it all. She had been tested, nearly broken, and now she understood the full impact of presence preparation and authority exercised with precision. David Greene's gaze swept the cabin one final time, lingering on each crew member, each passenger who had witnessed the events. "We proceed carefully from here," he murmured. "Observation, documentation, and vigilance. This flight is now more than transportation. It is a record of accountability, a lesson in authority, and a demonstration of justice." Talia's eyes followed him, then returned to the window. The distant horizon of Atlantic darkness stretched before her, but inside she understood the transformed landscape of the cabin. Authority had been corrected, power had been measured, and accountability had been established. The flight continued, engines, steady passengers observing the narrative, now firmly under the control of truth presence and careful, deliberate action. The lights in the cabin flickered briefly as the plane banked gently over the Atlantic, casting long shadows across the polished leather seats. Talia Greene adjusted her posture, feeling the lingering ache in her wrists and the tightness in her chest from the earlier ordeal. She kept her inhaler tucked safely in her pocket, a quiet reassurance that she might need it, but hoped not to. David Greene sat beside her, his presence calm, measured and impossibly precise eyes, scanning the cabin as if cataloguing every movement, every reaction, every subtle twitch of muscle. Brenda Miller lingered near the galley, hands pressed tightly together, lips pursed. The humiliation of the earlier confrontation had left her pale and uneasy. She had assumed authority, assumed control, and been proven catastrophically wrong in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras. Her posture betrayed a nervous energy, a silent calculation of how to navigate the aftermath while preserving what dignity remained. Officer Jim Miller stood near the forward bulkhead, jaw clenched, shoulders stiff, fully aware that every breath, every movement, every decision had been recorded and scrutinized. Accountability weighed heavily on him, and he shifted subtly conscious that further misjudgment could escalate consequences exponentially. David Greene leaned slightly toward Talia, voice low, but carrying weight that resonated with authority. Observe everything. Every gesture, every whispered word, every glance. They are all data points. Every action will be recorded and accounted for. Nothing escapes notice. Talia nodded, exhaling slowly, her chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. She felt the quiet authority radiating from him, a shield against any potential misstep, a statement of power that no one in the cabin dared contest. A young steward, barely 27, approached cautiously, tablet in hand. "Sir, I have compiled witness statements from passengers who observed the incident. Shall I submit them to the airline once we land?" David's eyes locked on the steward's precise sharp. "Yes. Include every detail, timing, dialogue, expressions, gestures. Accuracy is critical. We are not merely recording events. We are establishing a record that will hold weight beyond this flight." Brenda Miller's fingers flexed nervously, tracing the seams of her uniform as she reflected on the earlier confrontation. The assumptions she had relied upon, child in hoodie, perceived threat, automatic authority, had been dismantled. Every movement she made now felt scrutinized, recorded, and weighted with consequence. The recognition that her misjudgment had been exposed to a cabin full of passengers, some recording, others whispering, pressed on her like a physical weight. Officer Miller shifted his stance, aware that authority alone could no longer assert control in the presence of David Greene. His past training protocols and instinctive responses were now subject to moral and social scrutiny. Each movement was measured, each reaction deliberate. He understood that a single misstep could carry implications far beyond the immediate flight. Passengers whispered among themselves, subtle glances passing between them. A retired judge in row 3 murmured to his companion, "I've presided over disputes in courtrooms, but rarely have I seen authority exercised with such precision and impact." His companion, a former nurse, nodded eyes wide as she observed David Greene's controlled presence. Even in silence, the audience was aware of the magnitude of what had transpired. Assumptions, overturned authority, decalibrated accountability, established. David Greene rose slightly, movement deliberate, posture commanding yet unobtrusive. His gaze swept the cabin, cataloguing crew and passengers alike. "Let it be clear," he said, low but firm, carrying across the cabin, without raising his voice, any attempt to intimidate or misrepresent will be documented and addressed. Authority must not be abused, and every misjudgment carries consequence. Talia's eyes followed him, noting the subtle reactions of the crew and passengers. The steward, the hesitant glances, the tight-lipped expressions of attendants, all acknowledged the shift in authority. What had begun as a misjudgment based on age, appearance, and assumptions had evolved into a demonstration of justice and realignment of power. The intercom buzzed softly. "Cabin crew continue monitoring all passengers and report irregularities immediately." David Greene's eyes flicked to the speaker, registering the airline's attempt to assert oversight. He allowed a measured exhale. "Let them attempt control. Every move is being observed. Observation first. Correction second. No escalation unless necessary." Talia scanned the cabin. Subtle gestures, furtive glances, careful phone recordings, all indicated that the social dynamics had shifted completely. The retired couple from Boston whispered again, leaning forward slightly. "He isn't just protecting his daughter," the woman said. "He is demonstrating precisely how accountability should operate in real time." Her companion nodded, adjusting his glasses, pen poised. Authority exercised with awareness, presence, and restraint. It's a lesson for everyone here. Brenda Miller moved near the galley hand, rising slightly as though to speak, then dropping it. Every passenger watching every recording, every subtle exchange, had captured her earlier errors. The realization that her assumptions about race, age, and authority had been publicly exposed was overwhelming. Her uniform remained crisp, but her confidence had shattered. Officer Miller's hands flexed, knuckles white. The weight of scrutiny pressed on him, every move analyzed in the context of fairness and moral judgment. Authority alone had been insufficient. Judgment, awareness, and accountability were now the criteria. He shifted each movement, deliberate, cautious. David Greene returned to Talia's side, kneeling slightly. Ready for what comes next, he asked, voice controlled, resonant. Talia nodded. She understood that this was no longer merely about the flight, or her safety, or even the humiliation she had endured. This was about observation, accountability, and ensuring that truth would remain visible and undeniable once the plane landed. Passengers adjusted subtly in their seats. Some leaned forward, some whispered quietly, others lifted their devices. The cabin, once simply a space of luxury, had become a crucible of authority, ethics, and consequence. Talia realized she was not merely a passenger. She was a participant and a witness to the correction of an injustice, to the realignment of authority, to a demonstration of controlled power executed with precision. The hum of the engines grew slightly louder as the aircraft maintained altitude. Outside the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dark and infinite faint lights from ships shimmering far below. Inside each movement, each whispered conversation, each camera click was part of a larger narrative of observation, accountability, and ethical enforcement. Talia, small but resilient, absorbed it all. She had survived more than a single confrontation. She had witnessed the deliberate and measured correction of injustice. David Greene placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Every detail matters," he whispered. "Every gesture, every word. Every glance contributes to the record. Observation is now a tool of accountability. Authority is recognized, challenged, and corrected when necessary." Talia exhaled fully, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She understood the weight of the lesson presence. Preparation and precise action could override assumptions, prejudice, and misuse of power. The cabin settled into a tense, calm engines, humming steadily beneath polished floors and seats. The Atlantic stretched beyond the windows, infinite and dark, yet inside the first-class cabin had transformed. Authority had been questioned, recalibrated, and restored in its proper measure. Talia met her father's eyes, understanding fully that the first step of justice had been secured, but the ripple of accountability, observation, and consequence was far from over. David Greene straightened gaze, sweeping the cabin one final time. "We proceed with vigilance. Every witness, every recording, every subtle action will matter once we land. This flight is no longer just a journey. It is a record, a demonstration, and a precedent." Talia's eyes followed him, then returned to the window. The dark Atlantic below mirrored the weight of what had transpired in the cabin. Authority corrected, power measured, accountability asserted, and a lesson in justice set in motion. The wheels of the aircraft retracted with a subtle thrum, and the plane leveled into a smooth, steady glide over the English Channel. Talia Greene pressed her palms to the armrests, feeling the faint vibrations of the engines ripple through the floor beneath her. Her wrists were tender, a lingering memory of the zip ties, but her pulse had slowed, her breathing steady. Beside her, David Greene's presence was unwavering, a silent anchor in a cabin that still hummed with tension. Every passenger and crew member was aware of the shift in authority, a recalibration that had occurred in real time and would leave marks far beyond the fuselage. Brenda Miller, the lead flight attendant, remained near the galley. Her lips pressed tight, fingers fidgeting nervously. The weight of the earlier misjudgment pressed on her like a physical force. Every glance she gave Talia or David was measured cautious, as if her eyes alone could communicate contrition without words. Officer Jim Miller hovered nearby, jaw tight, shoulders stiff. His earlier confidence diminished under the unspoken scrutiny that David Greene projected effortlessly. David leaned slightly toward his daughter, voice calm but firm, carrying authority without raising it. Observe carefully. Every action, every reaction, every subtle hesitation is a record. They cannot manipulate the narrative if it is properly documented. Talia nodded, exhaling slowly, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her inhaler remained in her pocket, a comfort she no longer needed. She looked around, noting the passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation, their expressions ranging from awe to quiet admiration, and the crew who now navigated the cabin with cautious precision. The younger steward, still close to Talia, adjusted the service cart quietly. "Sir, I've completed compiling the statements from passengers who observed the incident. Shall I submit them upon landing?" David's eyes met his sharp, deliberate. "Yes. Include every nuanced timing, dialogue, facial expressions, gestures. Nothing is trivial. Accuracy is paramount. This is more than an incident. It is a demonstration of accountability in real time." The steward nodded, swallowing hard, aware of the gravity in David's tone. Brenda Miller shifted her weight, her hands flexing at her sides. The authority she had relied upon had evaporated, replaced by the undeniable presence of a man whose command extended far beyond the cabin. She understood now that her assumptions based on appearances, age, and perceived threat had been catastrophically flawed. Every movement she made, every subtle glance carried significance that could be recorded, observed, and used as evidence. Officer Miller adjusted his stance, fingers flexing subtly. His authority, procedural and trained, had been undermined. He realized fully that true control was not about protocol alone, but about perception, judgment, and the presence to correct missteps when authority is misapplied. Each subtle action he took now was measured and deliberate, constrained by the awareness that deviation could carry consequences far beyond this flight. The passengers whispered among themselves. A retired judge in row 3 adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking from Talia to David. "I've overseen courtroom disputes, but rarely have I witnessed authority exercised with such deliberate precision and moral clarity," he murmured. His companion, a former teacher, nodded eyes wide. "They've corrected an injustice in real time," she whispered. "This is not simply a flight. This is a lesson in accountability and human judgment." David Greene rose slowly. Posture precise, every movement controlled. He walked the aisle gaze, sweeping the cabin, cataloguing each passenger, each crew member, each subtle response. "Let this be clear," he said, low and deliberate, carrying across the space without a raised voice. "Any attempt to intimidate, misrepresent, or misuse authority will be recorded and addressed. Every misstep has consequences." Talia's gaze followed him, absorbing the subtle responses of the crew and passengers. The cabin had transformed from a space of luxury and comfort into a stage of ethical reckoning, observation, and recalibration of power. The assumptions that had fueled the initial confrontation were gone, replaced by recognition of authority, exercised with precision, fairness, and accountability. The intercom buzzed softly. "Cabin crew maintain vigilance and report any irregularities immediately." David's eyes flicked to the speaker, acknowledging the airline's attempt to assert oversight. He allowed a slow, measured exhale. Let them act. Observation. First correction. Second. No escalation unless necessary. Talia's eyes swept the cabin, noting subtle gestures, passengers adjusting in their seats, discreet phone recordings, whispered conversations, heads tilted in acknowledgement. Every passenger was aware that what had occurred was not merely an altercation. It was a recalibration of authority, a demonstration of measured, deliberate power in action. David Greene lowered himself slightly toward Talia, voice calm, resonant. "Every action from here on is part of the record. Witnesses' recordings and statements will matter once we land. Observation is a tool. Authority is recognized, challenged, and corrected when necessary." Talia exhaled fully, chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She understood now the weight of the lesson, the precision of accountability, and the power of presence. The engines hummed steadily beneath them. Outside the Atlantic stretched dark and infinite, dotted with faint glimmers of distant ships. Inside the cabin had transformed every whispered word, every subtle movement, every glance carried meaning. Talia understood that this was no longer just a flight. It was a demonstration, a record, a precedent in how authority and justice could be applied even in a confined, high-pressure environment. David Greene's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "Remain calm. Observe. Document. Nothing escapes notice. This is more than a journey, it is accountability in motion, and the lessons here will ripple far beyond this cabin." Talia nodded, feeling the full weight of his presence and the quiet authority he wielded. The zip-tied marks on her wrists were fading, but the imprint of the lesson, the assertion of truth, fairness, and vigilance remained vivid. The cabin settled into tense calm. Engines thrummed steadily beneath polished floors. Passengers shifted, some whispering, some adjusting phones, others leaning back to take in the magnitude of the moment. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. Authority had been challenged and corrected, assumptions overturned, and accountability firmly established. Talia, small but resolute, absorbed it all. She had endured, observed, and learned. David Greene's gaze swept the cabin one final time, lingering on the crew and passengers who had witnessed the events. We move forward carefully. Every gesture, every glance, every statement will be part of the record. The precedent is set. Observation, accountability, and presence define authority now. Talia's eyes followed him, then returned to the window, absorbing the dark Atlantic below, reflecting on the journey that had transformed the cabin into a crucible of justice, presence, and ethical power. As the plane continued toward London, engines, steady passengers settled into a cautious silence. The story captured in hundreds of devices documented in memory and observation would ripple far beyond this flight. Talia exhaled fully for the first time, chest rising and falling, feeling the weight of what had transpired, and the assurance that authority, when exercised wisely and with vigilance, could correct even the gravest misjudgments. David Greene squeezed her shoulder lightly. "We did this right. Stay composed. Every action from here matters as we land." She nodded, eyes scanning the cabin one last time, witnessing the subtle shift in perception, the quiet acknowledgement from crew and passengers alike. The plane hummed over the water engines, steady lights flickering across the cabin, reflecting polished trays, leather seats, and faces forever altered by what they had witnessed. The first-class cabin, once a space of comfort and exclusivity, had become a stage of accountability, justice, and observation. Authority had been challenged, recalibrated, and restored in measured, deliberate fashion. Talia understood fully that she was more than a passenger. She was a participant and witness in a moment that would resonate far beyond these walls, a lesson in vigilance, fairness, and ethical power. As the lights dimmed further for the flight's overnight cruise, David Greene's hand rested lightly on her shoulder. "We are prepared," he whispered. "The narrative, the record, and the precedent are all secure. Every action matters." Talia closed her eyes briefly, drawing a deep, steadying breath. The ordeal was not over entirely, but they had won the first crucial victory. Authority had been corrected, judgment recalibrated, and accountability firmly established. If you found this story compelling and want to see more moments where justice and courage triumph, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment.